Orange. I'm an artist that specializes in algae-based bioplastic. So what you see here is sheets of bioplastic made from red algae. The two red algae that I use are Gelidium and Gracilaria, and they're processed into what is known as agar. So at the beginning of 2020, I spent a couple of months in Morocco researching the supply chains to make sure they were sustainable and renewable. It's a really comprehensive process they have in Morocco. So what happens is that 1 year and a week after the last harvest, harvesters are allowed to contract an independent marine biologist to dive down and assess the harvest sites to make sure that there's a good enough crop that is able to be harvested. From there, they have to apply for paperwork to the government department, and once they're issued with their permit, they're able to dive down and take a very controlled amount of this seaweed. The process is a very simple process. Basically, the seaweed is dried, the sand and salt is shaked off it, it gets boiled, and then basically that liquid is then kind of condensed into a big soup a couple of times. Then they get big flaky bits, and from there they ground down into a powder, and it's that powder that I use as a polymer. Now, a polymer it means many molecules, basically. So on a molecular level, it's a complex molecule that has many, many bonds. This polymer, as opposed to petrochemical polymers, is a much more simple polymer. So it's still got many bonds, it's still complex, and it still makes a moldable material, so a plastic, but it's much more degradable. These ones here, the ones that I develop, are actually degradable at home, in a home setting, in a process that's as simple as boiling pasta. So what I'm making behind me on this glass is a patchwork of small rectangles that I'm making here on site at the Biennale. Today I've been cutting the little sheets into rectangles, and I put aside the offcuts. Yesterday I used the offcuts that I'd previously cut off to boil down to make the sheets that I cut off and affixed today. So it's a thermo-resettable, recyclable plastic that fits into a closed-loop system that can be recycled at home using a low-energy process. The colors that you see in these have some spirulina. So on my desk here, you see Athrospira platycis, which is a freshwater variety of spirulina. It's bubbling away, growing on the desk. It doesn't need any air to grow, all it needs is light. The air is to circulate the microalgae around to make sure they all get access to the light. Microalgae, or cyanobacteria, they have many other names depending on which department you're talking to. They were the first organism to start photosynthesizing on this planet. So they began the oxygen atmosphere that began the evolution of more complex life forms. Green plants that you see growing anywhere, if they can perform photosynthesis, they have a chloroplast within each of their cells that contains the DNA of cyanobacteria. In every breath that we take, even today, 50 to 80% of that oxygen was made by cyanobacteria. They inhabit almost every drop of water that you find in a body of water, whether it's brackish water, fresh water, salt water. If you take a sample, you're very likely to find a cyanobacteria in that water sample. They are microplankton, single-celled organisms. They're tiny, and they've existed on the planet for more than 3.5 billion years. The other interesting thing about cyanobacteria is that petrochemical plastics are made from petroleum, which is made from ancient cyanobacteria, ancient algae, that's been compressed under the earth under high pressure for millions of years, and unfortunately is really destructive in the way that it's harvested. So we're also running out. It's a finite resource, and it's an incredibly ancient resource. What I'm using in my plastics is the cyanobacteria as a pigment, which is a bit of a nod to the petroleum that petrochemicals are made of, that I'm replacing with a new seaweed, a new petroleum-free seaweed plastic. So the pigments that you see here, the dark spots are made from spirulina, which I grow on my desk. In the 3 blue works in front, it's a mix of the cyanobacteria pigment as well as some blue food-safe pigment. These works right in front of you here have the dark spots are made of that spirulina and also some charcoal. The red is a pigment, and this one is just made from the charcoal and spirulina. I've been working with these petroleum-free plastics for a couple of years. It's a bioplastic that I've developed independently in my studio over the last couple of years. It's interesting because I started off making this as part of my artistic practice as a solution to the plastic problem that we're facing. And what I've ended up with is a functional plastic that can exist outside of my art practice. It can, I guess, walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And so as a result of the demand that I've faced from exhibitions like the one here, Jessie has been really interested in using it as an exhibition design material component to get rid of unsustainable plastics. I also have a lot of inquiries from other artists who'd like to use sustainable materials, and from the building industry, architectural industry so far. So I actually, at the start of last year, I launched a design practice called Other Matter, and it sits separate to my artistic practice, and it exists symbiotically using all of the IP that I've developed in my studio as part of my artistic practice, looking at a speculative future where we might be using more degradable and friendly to the environment plastics. And what I've ended up with is a company that works to replace those petrochemical plastics right now. When I was invited to participate in rivers, obviously the provocation is about rivers, it's about waterways, it's about equality and making sure that these bodies of water have rights. What we're ending up with today is that the petrochemical plastics that we are often using as disposable things are going to leave a mark in the fossil record far beyond our lifetimes. We're going to end up with big pens being unearthed in millennia. And so as a provocation for that, I think I've been spending a lot of time with that idea that plastics that are so cheap we're not paying the proper price for them. We don't pay the proper price for oil and the destruction that causes, the real estate that these plastics are going to take up for lifetimes, the risk that they put a whole bunch of life forms at. They're lethal. And so in thinking about that, in thinking about a more ethical plastic, something that's not going to put other lives at risk, these materials here are, they have the potential to be beneficial rather than dangerous to other life. So at the end of the useful life for these plastics, they can be either recooked in my studio or in a home setting really easily. They could be put back into the soil where they'll be eaten by the life forms in there. They can be put back into a waterway where they can be used by those too. Or they could be eaten by us as well. They're technically edible. I don't design them for their taste or texture, so I don't recommend it, but it's possible. This installation is called The Myth of Nature. It draws on theories that I've been spending a lot of time with, particularly Val Plumwood, but also Karen Barad, Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, thinking about how we refer to nature, thinking about how we refer to nature as an other and what that language does to nature, or this concept of nature in othering it. So when you think about who gave nature, it doesn't exist, but who labeled these other things as other than us, it comes from a colonial background, it comes from a biblical background, and it's rooted in this idea of having dominion over other things, using them up and exploiting them. So what I'd really like to spend time with in kind of peeling back the layers of meaning of this installation is about removing the separation. We're actually part of nature, we're animals, and we need to exist in a much more equitable way. We're part of it.